Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Levy. Welcome to the 8th Annual Frey Lecture in Intellectual Property. We have a great turnout today. The lecture was established by our 1985 graduate, Kip Frey, and his wife, Meredith. Kip is with us today. Kip is an entrepreneur and an educator. He's taught here at the law school. His devotion to the law school and to creativity and collaboration in the field of intellectual property is underscored by his support of this very lecture series. We are grateful to him and to Meredith for their friendship to our faculty and to our students, and for their many contributions to the law school and to the university. Each year, the Frey Lecture brings a distinguished thinker, scholar, or practitioner to the law school to discuss issues related to the field of intellectual property and innovation. And this year, we are delighted to welcome William F. Patry, Senior Copyright Counsel at Google Incorporated. Professor James Boyle has the honor of introducing our distinguished speaker, and I have the honor of introducing Professor Boyle. As everybody in here probably knows, Professor Boyle is a law professor here at Duke Law School. He's a brilliant teacher and scholar. He's a leader in the study of the public domain, and he directs the Duke Law Center of that same name. He is a founding director of Creative Commons, which works to facilitate open access to art and cultural materials. His latest book, The Public Domain, Enclosing the Commons of the Mind, has won numerous awards and accolades, probably will be made into a movie, but in the meantime, it may be downloaded in its entirety from the internet for free. Professor Boyle.
Thank you. I didn't know I was going to get an introduction. That's a little extra, Philip. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Kip. Thank you, Meredith, for setting up the Frey Lecture Series, which we've had some really remarkable people here. We've had Nobel laureates. We've had sort of great thinkers. We've had people intimately involved in the industry, in policy, in legal theory. And today we have Bill Patry. Bill is Senior Copyright Counsel at Google. He's also those of you who have seen the, one has to say, quite thick volumes in the law library that say Patry on copyright, Patry on fair use, this would be that Patry. He's a person whose knowledge of copyright law is encyclopedic. I think the original Frey Lecture was scheduled for about 11 hours so that he could get the full details out there. And Bill is also someone, apart from being a scholar, a former academic, someone who's intimately involved in the cutting edge of copyright policy working at Google, though his comments today, I think, reflect entirely his own thoughts and should not be attributed to his employer. What's even nicer is that Bill is kind of closing the circle here in his new book, a wonderful book, Moral Panics and the Copyright Wars. He addresses the ways in which we talk about copyright, really takes a step back and say, how is it that we talk about copyright? And in discussing that today, he's actually going to use, as an interlocutor, the late Jack Valenti, who gave one of our earlier very successful Frey Lectures. So in this sense, the Frey Lecture, and this is what we always wanted, has become a conversation that is worldwide, in fact, as people download it across the world, but also one which brings new scholars here to re-engage with the issues that we've already entered into. Welcome, Bill. Great to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Dean. I think I should have somebody to introduce, but I also want to acknowledge how great it is to see Jerry Reichman and other friends at Duke, David Lang, and to meet new friends like Jennifer. And I also want to thank Balfour Smith, who is an amazing person. The poster, I think, is astonishing. Forget, that it's about my book. It's just an amazing work of art. And I told him I want to take it home. And he also does fantastic administrative assistance. I don't know what other people's views are about what it must be like to work for Google. But I can tell you, I have no secretary, no administrative assistant. I lick the stamps and do everything else on up. So to have someone like Balfour to help me is truly to spoil me, and I appreciate it. And I'm, of course, also spoiled by having the honor of giving this lecture. I was told I was a non-controversial choice among the faculty, and having been a full-time law professor for 5 years, I find that remarkable. But I give full credit to the faculty and to, of course, Kip and Meredith for their vision in having a lecture series that would talk about cutting-edge issues. I hope to live up to the vision, and if I don't, I hope that you will hold me to account at the end of it. As Jamie mentioned, my talk is really a reply to Jack Valenti's 2003 Frey lecture. I knew Mr. Valenti from my days as being copyright counsel to the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee. I admired Jack tremendously, even if I rarely agreed with the causes that he was putting forth. I wish he were here. If he were here, we could have what he called a colloquy. But he's not, unfortunately. But I do believe that we honor him by continuing to discuss the ideas that he advocated with great passion and zeal throughout his life. I apologize if some think that if I criticize his speech, which I will do, that it's disrespectful. I don't think that he would have thought about it that way. And this isn't, after all, Dante Wesley, hitting Cliff Smith during a punt return, right? There are no winners, there are no losers. We're not settling scores. It's just, a beautiful North Carolina afternoon, and we're having a conversation. So that's all that I intended to be. Now, his talk in 2003 was about what he called moral imperatives. In my opinion, moral imperatives are really classic moral panics. So you can see why the name of my book is Moral Panics in the Copyright Laws, why this was really an excellent topic for me to build off of. And what I wanted to do, since Jack isn't with us, was to play a video excerpt from his talk so that he could make his case in his own words, right? Rather than me characterize them for you and misstate them, I thought it was far fairer for him to do it. And I'll start with his introduction. His introduction has two parts. The first part is a story that he tells about going to hear a Texas preacher when he was 10 years old. He grew up in Texas, and so he tells this story in his introduction, and then he goes into his part about moral imperatives. So I wanted to play this for you because not all of you were here in 2003. Some have graduated after then, I hope. and so I wanted to let him say his own thing. So there we go, Balfour.
First thing I'm going to do is start my stopwatch. But I got to tell you a story about this. When I was a small boy growing up in Houston, Texas, growing up Catholic and the grandson of Sicilian peasants, in a part of Texas that was the Bible Belt, where there were very few Catholics, and you can bet your bottom dollar damn fewer Sicilians, I can tell you that. I used to go to Mass with my family at 7 a.m. every Sunday, and then, excuse me, I would go with my Protestant buddies to what is known in Texas as a brush arbor revival. On a flat piece of parched Texas earth, they have a tent, 500 folding chairs, and a pulpit where circuit riding preachers would come in for a couple of hours, kick the hell out of the devil all the way up and down the Texas flatlands. And one day I was with a 10-year-old friend of mine and his father, and there approaches the pulpit this preacher who's known to be the greatest filibustering preacher of all time, could go 4 to 5 hours and never have to go to the bathroom. That's a terrible situation. So the first thing he did is he hauled out a big pocket watch and put it right in front of him. And my young friend tugged at his daddy, and he says, "Daddy, what does it mean when the preacher takes out that watch?" And the father leaned down and he said, "Son, not a goddamn thing." So I'm starting my stopwatch. Dean Bartlett, thank you so much. I had a chance to visit Duke Law School today, and as a fellow who always wanted to be a lawyer and somehow took the crooked path, I was very impressed, particularly with the technological advances that you have. I thought I was on a Star Trek set for a while there. It's incredible what you have done. I'm going to try to speak with you as brief a time as I can, and then perhaps we can have questions, because I think you and I talking together about this is something that's useful. I'm glad to hear that you had Larry Lessig here. Larry and I have debated 4 times, I guess, and I find him a thoroughly charming and brilliant man, although we're on the opposite sides of just about everything, including the Eldred decision, which I sat in the Supreme Court, and I told one of my friends it's going to be a 7-2 decision. Unfortunately, I didn't pick the right justice. I got Breyer right, but I didn't get the other one right. But Larry and I take our little show on the road, kind of like snappy songs and snappy patter, and we get along wonderfully well. So I have here 2 pages of my speech, and I hope that you'll allow me to bore you a little bit. But let me begin by saying no free democratic country, no free democratic country can lay claim to greatness if it doesn't construct some kind of a moral platform, a moral imperative, if you will, to guide the society and have the society recognize and respect civic trust. This moral imperative applies to every business, every industry, every profession, every university, and the government as well. It is defined by what William Faulkner called the old verities, words that really illuminate what a free and loving land is all about. Words like duty, honor, service, integrity, pity, pride, compassion, sacrifice. Now, if you regard these words casually, if you find them uncool, or if you treat them as mere playthings that only the rubes and the rabble and the unsophisticated and the unlearned observe and honor, then I'll tell you, my friends, you and I will witness the slow undoing of the great secret of America, without any question. Now,
what I want to do is dissect this speech with the aim of figuring out how we talk about copyright. So there are 3 parts to what I showed you. There was the introductory part about the preacher, and then there was the sort of patter about thanking the dean, which we all do, of course, for good reason, and the Star Trek stuff, and the Larry Lessig stuff, which shows how he can talk to the other side. And then there was the actual discussion about the moral imperatives part of it. Right, so I want to begin not with the moral imperatives part, but with the first part, the opening story about the preacher, and try to figure out what was going on there, the preacher and the stopwatch, right? So I've been giving copyright speeches for about 25 years, and I've certainly been listening to other people's speeches for longer than that. And when I saw Mr. Valenti's podcast, I studied it carefully, and I really studied the opening carefully, right? Some people try to, when they're giving speeches, they pick a story out of the hat. Or my father-in-law, depending upon what country he's in, he'll go and get a joke book from that country, and he'll try and find a funny joke from that country. But as you can see, Mr. Valenti was a masterful speaker and an amazing storyteller, right? He didn't pick anything out of a hat. Right? He wrote actually an excellent book about public speaking, which I have right here. Right? Speak Up with Confidence: How to Prepare, Learn, and Deliver Effective Speeches. Right? And I recommend it. You learn a lot from it, and you learn a lot about how he gave speeches and how he approached speeches. Right? He is one of those rare people who was fascinated with public speaking early. In his book, he talks about being 10 years old and becoming interested in public speaking. And at 10 years old, he actually gave his first public speech in Houston. And he talks about being a careful clinical observer of other people's speeches. Right? So when he gives a talk, while he did this sort of thing about, oh, I've only got 2 pages here and blah, 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 he remembered his speech. He memorized his speech. Right? It wasn't casual. There's nothing about that speech that was casual. If you read his book, you'll learn why that was the case. So I have a few questions for you. One of which is, how many of you do you think that the story about the preacher, that the purpose of that story was to talk about people who go on and on and on in their talks? Okay? Cool. How many people think that the purpose of the story was just to have a sort of introductory joke, to loosen things up and, like many speakers do? Okay? Cool. How many of you are mezzo, right, as he would say? How many of you think that the purpose of that story was a setup for the main part of the moral imperatives? Right? Cool. Me too. That's what I think as well. Sure, he wanted you to laugh at what he was saying, and it was a good story, right? It was a funny story. But I think that the content of that story about preachers was really directly related to what he was going to say and did say in that moral imperatives part, right? The part about the preacher kicking the devil up and down the Texas flatlands, right? So what he was doing was himself coming before you as a preacher, right? Giving you, and if you saw the rest of it, it was a fire and brimstone talk, right? And it was a talk about morality. But it wasn't just a talk about morality in general. It was a talk about our morality, right? It wasn't his morality. It wasn't his client's morality. It was our morality, right? That was the focus of the talk, right? So what he was doing, I think, was telling us a story. And the story, like all stories, had a purpose. The purpose of the story was to get us to think the way that he thinks. Right? I don't think it was coincidental that in the preacher story he was telling, he was 10 years old. Right? He was 10 years old when he first got interested in public speaking and gave it. Right? So that opening part was him telling us a story, but he was also in the story. Right? He was in the story as the 10-year-old at that Brush Arbor revival, and I claim he was in the story as the preacher, right? And so the story was a story about beliefs, right? And he was aware that when we hear stories, one of the things we do is to try to identify the beliefs that are in that story, right? And when we look for the beliefs, we look for beliefs that we already have, right? So what his purpose was, I believe, was to transfer the beliefs that we hold on really foundational religious issues, because that was the purpose of the beginning, right, to the economic views that his clients held. And he did that through a story. It wasn't something like, oh, well, if you believe in Christ, you have to believe in the MPA's views on copyright. Right? That doesn't work. Right? What works is telling a story in which you come to that conclusion. Right? That's what's effective. Right? Now, there is a whole academic field on social cognition that analyzes how we process thought, how we process knowledge. There's a wonderful book by Frank Smith called To Think. And in that, he says that thought flows in terms of stories. We learn in terms of stories. We can't help thinking but in terms of stories. Stories are the way that we make sense of the world. There are two other professors, Robert Schenck and Robert Abelson, who have written a lot about stories and thought. And so they make these two propositions, one of which is that virtually all human knowledge is based upon stories that are constructed about past experiences. The second one is that new experiences are interpreted in light of past experiences. So according to them, all that we have as human beings are experiences and stories. That's how we learn. So you might say, well, what about beliefs? Where do beliefs come? This is sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? Do the beliefs come before the stories, or do the stories come before the beliefs? And they say, well, it really doesn't make any difference because they happen together. And what occurs in the knowledge and thought process for them is that the beliefs index our views about things, so that the story supports the belief. Now, when you say indexing for somebody who works at Google, that has a particular meaning for us, right? And I thought, wow, I get that. I actually understand that, right? So what I think was going on at that opening, right, is that the purpose of the preacher's story was to index, to set up a certain belief structure, right, which we would then apply to the main part of his talk, which is about moral imperatives, right? So in that main part of the talk, what he wanted us to do was to form beliefs about the very modern issues of copyright law, right? So one of the wonderful things that Jennifer and Jamie are doing is a new book here, right? Can I tell people about this? Yeah, right. Tales.
With a secret public domain.
Yeah, right. Tales from the Public Domain, Theft of the History of Music, and all about music and copyright, and it's going to be fantastic, right? But copyright law, as we know, is really a very modern construct. So what was going on was that there was this transference of belief about ancient morality tales to a very modern economic right. And by virtue of that transference, what was going on is that we were to believe that his clients are righteous and that we're sinners. And if you doubt this, those of you who were there will recall that during the answer period, he was asked, could you give me an example of an argument on the other side that you believe is valid? And his reply was, no, none, not a single one. Right? There was not a single argument on the other side that he believed to be valid. I found that surprising myself. And I found it particularly surprising because in 1994, he gave a speech for Louis Nizer, great trial lawyer, right? And in that speech, he had this quote. He says, when I encounter self-designated human repositories of divine truth, I remember an old Southern prayer. Dear Lord, let me seek the truth, but spare me the company of those who have found it. Right? Okay? He also said that there's a wise expression. Whenever you're pointing a finger at someone, 3 of them are pointing back at you. I assert, however, that the purpose of his sermon to you in 2003 was to point fingers at others, right? It was to assign moral shortcomings to us, to focus on our moral failures. And you do that by framing the debate away from your own clients, in this case, and onto others, right? And the others were the evildoers who used their works without permission. Now, he did this by also citing the old verities, right? He was quoting William Faulkner's 1950 Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Now, at that time, in the 1950s, and in 1950 in particular, Faulkner was really quite worried about the threat of nuclear war. And he was concerned about how this physical fear that people had was inhibiting the writers of fiction, that they were obsessed with this and that it was causing writer's block. Because if you were worried about being pulverized, it was hard to go back to your attic and write wonderful, free-flowing fiction. So he admonished writers not to give in to that fear and to instead concern themselves with this, which is what Mr. Valenti was referring to. This is what Faulkner said. He said he wanted writers to be concerned with the old universal verities and truth of the heart, the old universal truth, lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed. Love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. If you were paying attention to what Mr. Valenti said, there was absolutely that construct there, even down to the multiple ands. That's why I say he may have dangled those 2 things there, but he'd memorized it, right? And that's why he was a great speaker. That's why he tells people to memorize things and not just to read what you said. Now, in Faulkner's quote, in Faulkner's speech in the Nobel Prize, what he was talking about was the art of writing. He was talking about the art of storytelling. He wasn't talking about moral imperatives at all. But it was the genius of Jack Valenti, of course. This is a really postmodern thing, I believe, right? He quotes a writer who is talking about the art of storytelling to tell your own story about the alleged moral imperatives for copyright law. Right? And so you say, well, there's these ancient verities here, but then they get shifted to ancient moral values, because the speech is not about verities in Faulkner's sense at all. Right? It's about moral values. That's a very nice semantic sleight of hand to be able to equate those two things. Now, the moral panic part comes at the end of his, the clip that I showed, right, where he warns us that if we don't honor the moral values that he's putting forth, he says, and I'll quote here because I want to be accurate, "I will tell you, my friends, you and I will witness the slow undoing of the secret of America, no question." If you quote that in Canada as it did last week, people laughed. We may not laugh here, but it's a pretty broad statement there, right? But what he's getting at is that our failure to do what his clients want is going to lead us to the slow and sure destruction of the United States as we know it, right? That sort of conjuring up of an existential threat is an essential part of moral panic. So what are moral panics? Moral panics are a sociological term. They were made popular by British sociologist Stanley Cohen in the 1970s. He was trying to figure out this phenomenon of the media's overreaction to events, usually involving youth. In that time, it was the mods and rockers. Those of you who've watched the Austin Powers movies will be familiar with that a bit. But what he was concerned about was this sort of wild exaggeration to certain events. It's not that the events don't exist. It's not the Goebbels' big lie. It's something else. It's where there's some social tensions and people overreact to it. And because they overreact, they take certain steps. And usually those moral panics are created by people who use them for certain purposes, political purposes, or whatever it is. The Salem witch trials, right? McCarthyism, the comic book scares. I would say for some people today, President Obama is a moral panic. But his being Mr. Valenti, his purpose in this moral panic was to create a collision between values, right? And so one value he talked about, he represented as, really the bad child, right? So those of you who read the Haggadah during Pesach, during Passover, know about the 4 different children. Mr. Valenti, because he was, maybe because he didn't read the Haggadah, but also because, it was a polarizing thing. He only had 2, right? There's the bad and the good child. So who is the bad child? This is the bad child according to him. The bad child thinks that digital technology gives me all this power to roam the internet. And whatever is available there, I can take, and I do. Right? The other value, represented by the good child, recognizes that, well, digital technology gives me all this power. It isn't right for me to do it, so I don't. Right? Now, so profound was the conflict between the good and the bad child, the good and the bad values, that the collision, according to Mr. Valenti, puts in hazard the whole sustenance of the moral compact. So let's be concrete for a minute. Why not? Be different. So how can we be concrete here? How has the moral compact been put in hazard? During the question period, there was a young man who got up and said, I bought this box DVD set of the TV show Friends, right, for my wife. I would have done something different, but hey, okay, right? So, aesthetics aside, so we bought this set. And they had a toddler, maybe a 3-year-old. And the toddler, who didn't know how, what a great gift this was, took some Play-Doh and ruined one of the DVDs. And the DVDs could not be sold separately. He couldn't buy it separately. He couldn't replace it. But his question was really not about replacing that DVD, but a theoretical one, which is this. Given that this can happen, is it okay if I make backup copies in case another one gets damaged, right? And Mr. Valenti's answer is no. Sorry, can't do that. That would violate the moral compact. We also know from his answers that if in the digital world you circumvent software in order for you to do things which in the hard copy world would be fair use, that also puts in hazard the entire moral compact, right? So if you wanted to do something for classroom use that you could have done if you had a VCR tape, sorry, you can't do it because you'll violate Chapter 12 of Title 17, and doing so, is a big moral sin. All right, well, what happens if you're a parent who wants to do something in a moral way? Right? I have 8-year-old twins. I certainly do. So let's say you want to watch a movie with them, but the movie's got stuff that you wouldn't really want them to see. Right? So there was a company called CleanFlix that did this. And they marketed a software filter that when you played a DVD, it would filter out stuff that you thought was objectionable. Right? It didn't actually change the DVD. Right? It was a private performance, and the software did not change it. The motion picture studio sued over that. And in 2003, Mr. Valenti was asked about that, and he said, well, the choice is this. You either watch it as the director intended, or you don't. That's it. Right? Now, why? Because the director's original vision has to be respected. Now, when I was working for Congress, there was a big to-do about colorization and panning and scanning of movies. Right? Jimmy Stewart's It's a Wonderful Life had been colorized, and it was a really bad job. I mean, really bad. It was the first one that company did. It was a Canadian company. I actually went up there and talked to them, and they said, yeah, that was a really lousy job. But we can do better. That didn't help Jimmy Stewart, and so the directors were up in arms about this. And the studios were vehemently opposed to the director's original vision being preserved. To them, this was an economic issue, right? So you got to deal with it in collective bargaining. If they wanted to control what happened to their film post-production, post-release, you negotiate with us in collective bargaining. And if you don't get it, too bad. That's your choice. You can trade things away. Copyright is an economic right, not a moral right. All right. Well, what about the content of films? Forget about changing them afters. What about the films themselves? What about the issue of, you're corrupting the morals of society? Is it a moral issue then? So in that same 1994 speech that he gave, he said this. This is where he also quoted Faulkner about integrity, pride, pity, compassion. Right? He says, I think the time has come for all of us to stop complaining. Right? We are responsible for what we are. Don't blame the movies. Don't blame books for the ailments that plague and ravage the society. I think it's wrong. Right? In other words, the debate is always shifted away from them and onto us. We are who we are, and it's our own damn fault. So they don't have any responsibilities at all, even for things that they do directly. Right? You could say for books and movies, well, just don't go see them. If you don't like Friends, you don't have to buy the box TV set, and I haven't. In fact, right? I took his advice. Right. But what about the things the studios themselves do? So what about the moral compact? When the motion picture studios told universities like this one, you are responsible for 40% of our losses. Right? That was false. It was a completely false statement. Was that a moral thing to do? Was it moral for the studios then to use those false figures and go to Congress and get members of Congress to send letters to universities like this one and say your federal funding is going to be cut off unless you do something about this? Where was the moral compact when one of the motion picture studios threatened to sue an English stonemason? Now, what did this poor guy do? What he did was to put on a gravestone an image of Winnie the Pooh. And he did it at the request of parents whose child had been stillborn. Right? And so one of those companies threatened this guy for making that gravestone. Is that a moral thing to have done? What about trying to stop VCRs, as they did in the 80s? Or trying to control the rental market, as they also did in the 80s? Or trying to stop remote storage DVRs? As they did 2 years ago. Or right now, trying to stop Redbox from selling us lawful but inexpensive DVDs. Or last Congress, when the Motion Picture Association stopped the orphan works legislation from going through that people had worked a really long time on, and for something that really didn't impact them much at all. We can go back even further. How about the Hollywood Blacklist, right? Where you destroyed many people's lives on that. Or the antitrust violations that occurred at exactly the same time, right? So the Blacklist, 47, antitrust case goes to the Supreme Court. This is United States versus Paramount, where the government sues because they owned everything, right? They owned the writers, they owned the actors, they owned the directors, they owned the films, they owned the theaters as well. And so there's a lawsuit over that, and the Supreme Court 7-1 held that this was an antitrust violation because, in effect, it drove up the prices, and it also led to inferior films being made and shown in theaters. Because what theater owners had to do, there was block bidding, right? So you couldn't just show the film that you wanted to film, what you wanted to show. You had to show the one that they wanted to show you, and you had to take a whole bunch of other things, right? It's not actually the past, because there were blind bidding things that occurred in the 80s and 90s that were sued over too. Now, actually, Mr. Valenti referred to this, and he was asked this question about the motion picture industry, and he says, well, you know, the motion picture industry, as we know it, is interned in the Forest Lawn Cemetery. It died in 1950 when the Justice Department, and then he said, if there's a villain, it's the Justice Department. Why? Because they sued to stop this practice, right? So this isn't really old stuff. Now, why do I go through it? Not to question his integrity, because he had fantastic integrity. Not because I disliked him. I liked him a great deal. It's the approach to copyright that signifies, right? It's an approach. It's a black and white morality play issue. And in those morality plays, there's villains and there's victims. Right? That's why he said the Justice Department is a villain in that. So when you have victims and villains only, that requires line drawing, and it requires enemies, and it requires ways to separate out all of us into different camps in which there are good people and in which there are bad people. Right? And when that happens, it's sort of, you dehumanize people. Right? There's been lots of studies about how people can commit atrocities against others. And one of the ways you do it is by dehumanizing those people, you know, who you kill or do other bad things to, which you ordinarily wouldn't do if you regarded them as people like you. Right? So this sort of moral line drawing is really an essential step in dehumanizing other people. You create the line and you dehumanize them by doing that. So I don't find that to be a particularly helpful way, surprisingly, to talk about copyright, right? I think that the way that we've come to talk about copyright is really harmful. It's harmful to the sort of general social discourse, and it's harmful to business decisions, it's harmful to policy decisions, right? George Orwell said that if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. And to me, that's what's going on. These are actually business issues. They're not moral issues, and you have to solve them by business means. Invoking the ancient verities or ancient moral values is really a cry to preserve the past, right? It's not a way by which you're going to effectively deal with the future. So yesterday, Bob Iger, who's the head of Disney, said to other people in the motion picture industry, look, we're facing profound changes. And he said that you'll either have to adjust to these changes or you're going to no longer have a business. Right? That's not me saying it. That's some guy who's in the business. Now, you're not going to be able to do that if the way you approach it is as a morality play. Right? So in one of his speeches, then Senator Obama, although he may have been president-elect, said that what we need to do is to appeal not to our easy instincts, but to our better angels, right? And those better angels, I think, are found in a recognition that copyright law is a social thing, right? It's a social relationship. It's not property rights. It's not a moral panic. It's a way in which we try to figure out socially useful things. There are no copyright sinners, and there's no copyright saints. Right? We all have to figure out this together and what works best for all of us together, including copyright owners. right? But what I reject, and so the purpose of the talk was simply to say the morality plays, the moral imperatives are diversions. They're not helpful, and they're, in fact, harmful to us. So I'm happy to take whatever questions we have. I left plenty of time for questions, right?
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you also to Valenti and Jeff for taking some of this talk. So, questions? Sure.
My question is sort of if you were to flip his narrative around.
If I was a what?
If one were to flip around Mr. Valenti's narrative.
Yeah.
So that the black hat, white hat roles in the drama change. It seems like much of the discourse that I've read online about copyright issues, and I'm actually thinking here of related technology issue like net neutrality, which has been in the news a lot lately, where industry itself is sort of described as the bad guy. So you're saying that even if you have a situation where, say, the Motion Picture Association is acting perhaps immorally, you still think that for advocates of copyright freedom, it's better, rather than calling them on that, to just approach this in this functionalist way?
Right. So I would say, I'm not saying the Motion Picture Association is acting immorally, and I wouldn't use moral terms at all.
I'm saying they're acting immorally.
Oh, okay. Great. Then you can probably answer your own question, too, I would think. However, so I don't think it's helpful to resolve questions by calling them Luddites or dinosaurs or whatever. To me, it's a normal reaction. So one of the things I was trying to figure out is why do people act particular ways, right? Why do the copyright industries tend to always oppose new technologies? You could take the view that some on the copyright left do, that they're just simply Pavlovian. You know, they'll never get it. They're always opposed to the past, and they always just want to hang on to stuff, and they hate consumers, and they hate technology. I don't think empirically that's true. Compact discs are an example where it wasn't true. So for me, I had to figure out some other explanation rather than morality. And you would say, well, they're businesses, and they want to make money. But then the next problem is, well, how come they screw it up so often? Right? How come they actually don't make decisions that seem to be in their best interest? Right? If they were successful in shutting down VCRs, that would have been a terrible thing for them. Right? Right? So you actually can't let them. But that sounds a bit paternalistic, to say, well, I know my business better than you do. Or I know your business better than you do. So the answer, I think, was that this is what this involves is a conflict between new and old business models that is generated by disruptive technologies. Right? And that's what Iger was talking about. So many people in the content industries will say, you can talk all you want to about digital distribution and long tails and all that sort of stuff, but in the end, what you're asking us to do is to exchange analog dollars for digital dimes. That's a bad bargain for me. I don't think that's the way to think of it. You don't have the choice to hold on to analog dollars as long as you want. That's not your choice. That's the market's choice. And one of the things about digital technology is that it's enabled consumers to force that, because you can't control it. In the old days, they could control the physical way in which things were distributed, and you had to take it or not. That's not true anymore. And so what Bob Iger was saying yesterday is essentially this, I think. It doesn't matter whether we like it or not. All right? These are very profound changes. And if you don't get with it, you're not going to have a business. So the way I approach it is that these conflicts are ordinary. They're normal. And that innovation is a real threat to everybody. And it should be a threat. That's what innovation is. Right? When you hear politicians talk about innovation policy, they say, well, we're pro-innovation. I have a hard time believing it. Because what they're really saying is they want incremental change that doesn't upset anybody. It's not that they wouldn't like things to be innovative. They would. But they don't want anyone to be upset. And because they don't want people to be upset because they're going to complain. And that causes problems, right? Most members of Congress would prefer not to vote on things because it's a problem to vote on things. People won't like the way you vote. And any change you're going to make is a change that's going to alienate people. That's many people's view of innovation. I want innovation that makes my life better, but that doesn't change anything for anybody. That's not innovation. Innovation is inherently disruptive. And so I understand why people don't like it. I don't like change in my own world either. You know, you get used to doing things, and maybe you work really hard to get where you are, and you like where you are, and you're comfortable with it, and it's a good place for you to be. But you can't stay there forever, right? Dylan Thomas may have said, you know, rage, rage against the dying of the light, but he died too. And businesses do as well.
Bill, could I seize the chair to share prerogative? But let me handle Jack Valenti. So, isn't there a place for at least some moral discourse? Let's say I'm Jack Valenti 2.0, and I say, okay, I acknowledge there is a difference between stealing shoes from a shoe store and using it as a justification. I don't like the way that Nike treats its workers in Taiwan, and downloading a bunch of songs off a peer-to-peer network. But isn't there a role of actually saying to the student who's doing that, you do realize that in doing something, you're actually doing something that's illegal, and there's actually some kind of morality here? Or would you say to your own kids, your action may not functionally be best suited to the continued existence of the music industry? That seems, I mean, for an 8-year-old, as you said, that seems like a relatively minor slap on the wrist. Is that the way we should talk?
Right. So I want to separate out the economic issues and copyright policy, what members of Congress or other legislators should be doing, from what we should do. So I gave a talk in Harvard a week ago Friday, in the Joel Tenenbaum case. And I said to them, it's a mistake to have made Joel Tenenbaum a movement hero, or to have made Jamie Thomas a movement hero. They're not. Right? There are people who took stuff they shouldn't have taken. I don't agree with the size of the verdicts at all. I don't think that suing everybody under the sun is a good business strategy. That aside, it wasn't the right thing to do. And so with my own kids, you have to teach kids by example, right? Not by telling them, oh, do this because it's the right thing to do. That doesn't work. You have to do things that they will then see are correct. So I'm a big fan of the copyright industry. So I give them a lot of my disposable income. I buy over 300 books a year, and about 160 of them for my kids, which is not hard to do, by the way. So there's this one, they love chapter books and series things. So they just finished these things called the A to Z Mysteries, which is brilliant marketing, right? You got to buy 26 of them. Right? I think that's fantastic. And the books are fantastic. And there's these Geronimo Stilton ones, right? And Magic School Bus, Magic Treehouse, all these series. I love those. Scholastic is one of the greatest publishers ever in the history of mankind. So I give them a lot of my money, right? I take them to theaters. We've seen Ice Age 3 times. I can't wait till 4 comes out. I happen to know that the DVD is being released on October 27th. I'm expected to get that. They have Nintendo DS players, and because they're twins, they fight over everything, so I had to get 2 of those cartridges. They're $30, $35 a piece. Right? They have the cartridges for Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. I won't let them see the movie because I don't think it's appropriate for them, but I do buy them the Nintendo games, which they know of because they're on Nickelodeon. Right? I think that's great. I think that's the way it should be. And I try and teach them that this is the way you do it. You go to the bookstore, you buy the stuff, right? You go to the movies, and you buy the DVDs. So I believe that absolutely as a parent that we have the obligation, and that's the way I deal with it. But I don't think it's right to use copyright law, for example, to thwart what paying consumers actually want, right? To have used anti-circumvention to deny people the right to have a DVD player that has a record function, right? And that happened right afterwards, right? It happened as a result of the DMCA. The motion picture studios, by using code that they considered to be anti-circumvention, entered into license agreements with consumer electronics companies in which those companies had to agree not to have a record function, right? Because otherwise the DVDs they put out wouldn't play. I think that's not right. I think that's not helping consumers, so I oppose that. But I agree with the way that we, as parents and as people, have to act.
I think we've time for two more. Yeah.
So if Congress is supposed to talk more specifically in more economic terms, isn't that also devolved? Any choice they make is also essentially a moral choice as well. What type of consumer should have certain rights? What type of producers should be valued over others? And so aren't making those choices well also a type of moral choice? And if so, why is that more legitimate, that narrative more legitimate than the terms of a morality play?
Right. So I would say the choice is not a moral choice, but a social choice. Right? All property, how you assign property rights, if you want to call them that, to one group versus another group is a big policy decision. I don't regard it as a moral one, but as an important social decision. And the way that you resolve that social decision, I think, is going back to what the foundational purpose for that right is to begin with. And so I would say, in terms of copyright, that's a given. Right? We can debate and write law review articles about the myths and origins of copyright, whether it's utilitarian, whether it's a natural right, all that sort of stuff, and people do, and some people make great careers out of it. I say hats off to you. However, at the legislative level, we have to take, I think, as foundational that the purpose of copyright in the United States is to promote the progress of science, science with a capital S in the 18th century sense of increasing knowledge. So I would say what we have to do is empirically determine whether the particular right that's sought, or the exception to that right, it has to apply both ways, is going to increase knowledge. How would that work out? So if you were Congress in 1998 determining term extension, are we going to go to life plus 50 as we are now, or are we going to switch to life plus 70? Are we going to give the extra 20 years? The way I would answer it is to say, okay, if we give the 20 more years, is that going to lead to an increase in new works? If it is, yes. If it's not, don't do it. And the answer was clearly, don't do it. Right? Because there is no author on the face of the earth who would have said, I won't create under life plus 50. I got to have those extra 20 years after I'm dead. Right? So that was a bad decision. But I don't think it was an immoral decision. It was a bad empirical decision.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to ask if you think there is any usefulness to cases like the Tannenbaum case, because I do think that for the goals that you're describing, that you have something like thinking about an expansion of fair use could be useful in preventing things like having record functions being blocked in consumer electronics. Do you think that the Tannenbaum case is completely useless for a movement that's pro-consumer with respect to this?
I do. Yes, because I don't think it was fair use.
Why don't you explain what the Tannenbaum case
Right. So the Tannenbaum case was a peer-to-peer file sharing case, right? And there was a fair use argument that was made. It was rejected on summary judgment, and I think quite properly so. Right? I remember when I worked for Congress, there was a hearing about a consumer electronics product and uses of it in certain ways, and they were claiming a First Amendment right. And Barney Frank said, I'm a great believer in the First Amendment, but you cheapen it by bringing it into a commercial dispute. And that's the way I felt about fair use in peer-to-peer file sharing cases. If the purpose of it was to download something that you are then going to use in a transformative way to make a new piece or to criticism or comment on it, then yeah, sure, that's fair use. The Shepard-Ferry case, leaving aside, the facts of that as they come out now, you can debate that. So Judge LaValle is of the view that good faith is not an extra factor. So I assume if the case ever went up to him and he was on the panel, he would not care that he apparently lied about what photograph he used. There are others who think that good faith is a factor. But fair use, I think, applies to those things. It doesn't apply to somebody who simply doesn't want to pay 99 cents to iTunes to get a legitimate one.
Okay, on the left-hand side, yeah.
Do you think these really large verdicts that juries have returned on these P2P cases are evidence of the efficiency, are evidence of the effectiveness of framing this debate in a moral sense?
So I don't know what the juries thought.
Right.
And so I couldn't say what they thought. The amounts are staggering, right? And they do lead to exactly that question. I would like to think, and I will confess that I'm probably delusional in this, and that I want it to be rational, and I don't want it to actually be the answer that you're suggesting, right? So please take this with lots of grains of salt, and maybe as evidence that I'm in fact hypocritical on this. That's distinctly possible. What I would like to believe is the case is that those particular ones went to trial for certain reasons, right? If you're the RIAA, and if you've gotten a lot of flack for bringing those, if you're going to take a case to trial, it better be a really good one, right? It better be a good one that if you win, you're going to be able to defend it and say that we should have taken this to trial because this person acted in a bad way, right? So in both of those cases, there were facts that were problematic in any case, right? Destruction of evidence, lying about what you'd done. And so I would like to think that the jury verdicts in that case reflected the really bad facts about how those people acted, right? And statutory damages can have that sort of element to them. So recognizing that I may be completely wrong, I would like to think that that's the case, right? And that an ordinary case of peer-to-peer file sharing that didn't have those facts wasn't taken to trial. Right? There haven't been cases that have gone to trial where the facts that were sort of ordinary and routine, that somebody, for example, was using Kazaa and maybe didn't realize that the default was allowing people to come in and take it, and that once they were on notice, they stopped doing it, and they said, I'm sorry, I'll eliminate all of the songs from my hard drive, and I'll pay you a certain amount of money. Those cases haven't gone to trial. And I think probably for good reason. So that would be my hopeful answer.
So we're going to finish now, but for those of you who didn't get to ask questions, I think Adam had one, and maybe others, there's also going to be a book signing immediately following outside, where you can purchase, not download, purchase a copy of the book, and I'd like you all to join me now in thanking you.
Thank you. Thank you.